Okay, I think we can start. So yeah, welcome everyone to today's webinar, which is an RFF-CMCC-NAVIGATE webinar with the topic critical reflection on integrated assessment models, or IAMs, and their scenarios. And we're very happy to have with us Isabela Butnar, who is presenting a paper which has been just published based on this topic. She's a senior research associate at the UCL Energy Institute, and she will present this paper in a minute. But just let's start with a very brief introduction first to this webinar series, which is co-sponsored by Navigate, which is the next generation of advanced integrated assessment modeling, an EU Horizon 2020 project that started in 2019 and whose purpose is to kind of improve and further develop integrated assessment models, which is a core topic of today's talk. So I think it's very well fits within this project. Just to give you an overview, it's a project with a lot of institutions that you can see here on the right, both in Europe and also overseas. Which has three, let's say, main focuses, I would say. One is focusing on systems which are relevant to the energy transition, climate mitigation pathways, here looking at the role of technology or at the macro level, and also demand side, consumers, and the transformation of consumers of goods and services. The second main focus is the people dimension, looking in improving spatial and social heterogeneity of these models, taking into incidence of policies, etc., and also impacts and co-benefits, so other dimensions of welfare related also to the SDGs. And finally, the point is the focus is also on increasing usability and outreach of these models, making them useful, making them accessible, making them transparent, and so on. And this is, I think, where this webinar really fits very well too. It's about IAMs, how they have been used, and how they can, let's say, a reflection on them. So this just is a slide giving you an overview of IAMs that they're widely used. Here you see a couple of applications, very well known, of course, the IPCC, who has been using them throughout its latest assessment reports, but they're also used increasingly, for instance, by the NGFS for the work of central banks. Maybe you saw the IEA's recently published net zero report. But there's also other things like country-level energy system planning or SDGs, and even companies using IAM. So I think they are widely used. So it's relevant also to think critically from scientific perspective about the status of this literature. To finish, just a very quick technicality. So we have, of course, audio and video deactivated by default to avoid any disruption. You have two ways to interact with the speaker or the panel, which I will introduce in a second. One is, of course, writing a question in the Q&A section, which you can find on the bottom. You can start writing questions also throughout the talk, and then I will pass the questions to the speaker or the panelists. Or you can also raise your hand, but this only in the last half an hour when we discuss the topic, if you want to be given the floor to address your question verbally. But I think given the number of participants, it might be best if you try to use the Q&A section so we can address as many questions as possible. Note that this webinar will be recorded on YouTube and well, may be available on YouTube and on our website. If you have any questions, here you see the email address and the website. And the next webinar that from CMCC is actually, it's a CMCC webinar on the 17th of June on the North Atlantic Ocean dynamics and on how modeling here can be improved, as you can see here. So with that being said, let's give the floor to Isabela. And as I said, we are very happy actually today that we had 6 additional panelists who are actually co-authors and lead co-authors on this paper, which are Oriane, Panagiotis, Julien, Roberto, and Will. And we're very happy that they also joined us for this hour. And I will then hopefully in the second half an hour address the questions to all of them or to the respective topic that they are mostly experts in. So we hope to have a very lively discussion after that. But with that being said, let me stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Isabela, who will give us a brief overview of this review paper on critical assessment on the role and status of integrated assessment models, which should last up to 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. Thank you very much, and we talk to you in half an hour. Isabela, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Johannes, do you hear me well? And you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I would just start saying that what you will be hearing in the next 25 to 30 minutes is a summary of a paper recently published, led by my colleague Ilka Kepon. It's a collaboration paper between 17 researchers across 16 institutes, and today online with me are also, as Johannes said, colleagues from other institutes. So we are trying to represent as best as we can the other co-authors on the paper. I will start by giving you a little bit of the context of how we come up with this, and Johannes already hinted that the IAMs have emerged as key tools for building and assessing long-term climate mitigation scenarios. They are complex and large models which capture several interacting systems, including energy, economy, and land use. They can build and analyze the carbonization pathways, providing insights on the available options, consequences, and of different strategies for greenhouse gas emission reduction. Their analysis based on such models play a central role in IPCC assessments, as we have seen from Johannes's presentation, also in other kinds of audiences like the NGFS or country level analysis. So their influence is way beyond the academia. In parallel, there have been raising concerns from the scientific community related to the capabilities of IAMs to capture the key elements of the real world, as they say, and how the results and recommendations from IAM analysis translate into real mitigation activities. So we set off to review the main critics of integrated assessment modeling in the literature, but at the same time contextualize them within the research efforts undertaken by the IAM community to respond to these critics, including learning from other research fields. We aimed at identifying research gaps and suggesting new steps for improving performance and communication of IAMs to the broader climate change community. How did we do that? I've seen we were 17 co-authors on the paper, so we all started in parallel doing a focused literature review of critiques of IAMs. We also got input from the wider Navigate consortium. Then we pulled all our findings together and grouped the recurring topics across the review teams into 6 broad areas of critique, of which I will be talking next. And then we took one topic per team. We split into 6 teams and took one topic per team and discussed these critiques within the context of the IAM community ongoing research. Before I go into the results of the review, I would like to spend one moment at unpacking what we call integrated assessment models, because many times they are referred to as IAMs, but actually what you are looking at, it's a multitude of modeling approaches. This list I put up here is not meant to be complete, but it will give you a flavor of some similarities and differences between them, which are important to keep in mind at the time of looking at critiques and ways to improve these models. So usually all the integrated assessment models they integrate several disciplines, including engineering, economics, environmental science. They are usually global in scope, although there are national or regional scale IAMs. They cover sufficient greenhouse gas emission sources to be able to project anthropogenic emissions on long-term timescales to 2050, but is usually to the end of the century. And they all describe pathways that achieve long-term policy goals, for example, climate objectives, while highlighting trade-offs between the different choices available. This being said, each of the models work quite differently. They do consider different system boundaries, different socioeconomic and political representation. Each of the models started off from a smaller model. So models, for example, which started off as economic models are perhaps more fit for answering questions around evolutions of the economic systems, while models starting off as energy system models and growing up to be integrated assessment models might be better fit to answer questions around transitions in the energy system. The level of detail is also quite different between the different models. In this review, we only looked at detailed process-based integrated assessment models and excluded cost-benefit model from the review. The way they compute, the models compute the solution over the time horizon is quite different. It's, for example, optimization model do an intertemporal cost minimization versus simulation models, which take one period at a time. Heterogeneity is also quite differently represented, but we will talk about that in the following. So keeping this diversity of IAMs in mind, let's now dig into the key areas of critique we have identified. And the first one of them relates to actor heterogeneity, which is key to societal transitions. Integrated assessment models are critiqued for including a limited actor diversity, for example, aggregated consumers and producers in CGE type IAMs versus fully informed social planner implementing policies in optimization models, usually based on perfect foresight. Also, limited representation of inequality, social and distributional impacts. Now, when you think about modeling heterogeneity, if you are going to look at the heterogeneity, what it will happen is it means breaking something which was previously treated as a whole into individual pieces, at the same time specifying relationship between these pieces and between these smaller pieces with the bigger system. So inherently you will add more detail into a model which is already complex and large. So this combined with the long time frames and global scope doesn't necessarily lead to more accuracy. In the paper, we discussed two situations when the degree and type of heterogeneity is important. The first one is behavior is uncoordinated and differs between actors. This is important, for example, for assessing policies targeting specific groups or inequality, when the aggregated results are quite different, significantly different from the case of aggregated result. In the paper, we give examples of IAM modeling exercises which implement this, although we also recognize that these exercises are generally limited to consumer heterogeneity, and we identify that further research should be done in the direction of modeling heterogeneity of businesses, governance, and institutions, which will significantly change some of the current modeling conclusions. Also, besides the second, I almost forgot, the second type of situation is when behavior is coordinated and actors follow each other's behavior. So this is most IAMs address this inherently, but in the form of learning rates, diffusion constraints, or enablers. But there are also some examples of IAMs going further and assessing dynamics between social and technological learning, and we give some examples in the paper. Besides this point, another point we raise is that documentation of embedded assumptions to represent heterogeneity can be improved at the same time with improving heterogeneity in the models. If we go to the second key area, which is technology diffusion and dynamics, then the models have been criticized how they capture technology diffusion and the processes which determine the speed and the shape of these transitions. Technological change arises from a multitude of human activities, and some of the elements and drivers are represented in IAMs. For example, improved efficiency over time, endogenous or exogenous technological learning is usually present in all IAMs. However, less covered or not covered are changes in the product or service itself, for example, due to redesign or technology standardization, or spillovers from sectors which are not covered, in detail in the model. In relation to the speed of the technological diffusion, that is more model specific, being determined by the availability of technology substitutability options and system integration requirements. But in reality, the speed of diffusion depends on many factors such as energy and climate policies, but also non-policy drivers such as niche markets for certain new products, fit with the existing infrastructure, or public acceptance of technology. Now, rather than endogenizing these drivers, optimization IAMs represent technological diffusion by introducing expansion or decline technology constraints, either specific to technologies or groups of technologies. Simulation IAMs use multinomial logit functions to determine market shares, or CGs use capital motion equations. However, what we have been discussing in the paper is that the parameterization of these equations is a modeler choice. As a consequence, the models can explore and discuss the consequences of different diffusion rates on the wider system, but cannot provide insights into the limits of diffusion rates themselves. So, for example, what is needed to reach specific levels of technology deployment, for example, new infrastructure or changes in the supply chain or behavioral change. So there is quite a lot of currently of active IAM research to cover wider drivers behind the diffusion speed. Not least, we're trying to include some empirical factors into the diffusion equations. A third area of critique is the representation of capital markets and finance. Now, our review identified critiques related to the representation of the financial system, leading to overestimation of crowding out effects of green investment on investment in other parts of the economy. And on the other side of the spectrum as well, consideration of no crowding out, which basically means that the agents have unlimited access to financial resources, which can also be misleading. Another category of critiques relates to perfect capital markets, in which capital flows from developed to developing countries, which is not observed in reality. Now, modeling the financial system touches on whether the transition to low carbon creates new sectors and occupations, which is still a current debate in and outside of the IAM community. And this relates to our understanding on the role of banks. Do we understand them as creators of finance, in which case investment, new green investment leads to the creation of new sectors and therefore to structural change? Or do we model banks as simply as channels for limited savings, in which case green investments may lead to crowding out of resources in other sectors? Related to the capital markets, there has been research going on in IAMs to improve their representation, and the different types of developments depend on the type of IAM. For example, CGE type IAMs looked at including financing schemes for the repayment of loans, detailed budgeting of debt across time and agents' disposable income, debt accumulation and debt stability, while the demand-driven ones consider finance created by demand and include worthiness of borrowers to assess when the banks may not lend the money. Now, in spite of these advances, we still identify key gaps in a more definite way of treating the allocation of finance between borrowers and how creation of financial capital happens. The fourth area relates to the representation of economy and its feedback with the energy system. And a first critique, which is perhaps one of the oldest ones, it relates to the assumption of perfect functioning markets, which ignore frictions observed in real world. Indeed, most IAMs rely on conventional economics, either through optimal growth models with perfect foresight or recursive dynamic CGEs with limited market imperfections. However, several IAMs have now long explored the implications of second-best formulations or either operate out of equilibrium. However, this is not mainstreamed, and further studies should aim at better reflecting the plurality of the visions of the economy. A second critique relates to the feedbacks between the energy and the economic system in transition to low carbon. By now, most integrated assessment models have evolved to be hybrids, so they are either energy systems linked to macroeconomic growth models or CGE or other economy-wide models with explicit technologies in key sectors. This means that they are capable of capturing some of macroeconomic feedbacks of the energy transition pathways, but with model-dependent degree of sophistication. A more recent critique relates to limited representation of life cycle impacts of technologies, in particular affecting representation of indirect economic, energy and resource impacts of low carbon technologies. Whilst we give in the paper some examples of IAMs trying to fill these gaps, but this is still a very active research area trying to expand IAM capabilities with other features, or linking them to other models, for example, life cycle assessment or industrial ecology. Finally, there is a critique pointing to unrealistic decoupling suggested by models between economic growth and emissions or energy, particularly in developing countries. In reality, no real long-lasting decoupling has been observed in the real world. Yet the nature of transitions to deeply decarbonized systems are by nature disruptive. So we identified this as a research gap and suggested also included effects that climate change could have on economic growth. We are coming now to the fifth area of critique, and this relates to policy representation in IAMs. Usually the IAMs take one of two ways of representing mitigation policies. For example, policies which target emissions or other environmental outcomes in the form of carbon pricing or emission standards, or by implementing sectorial policies targeting specific technologies, for example, subsidies or feed-in tariffs, phasing out fossils. Model intercomparisons run by the IAM community show that implementing one or the other approach to policy lead to very different outcomes in terms of cost-effective transition pathways, both in terms of the mitigation cost, but also the shape of transition. And we noticed that although carbon pricing might be easier to be implemented in IAMs, the socio-technical energy transitions literature suggests that carbon pricing is not known to promote development of technologies in early stages of innovation. So implementing sectorial policies might be more appropriate, but this is much more data consuming. And here we suggest more collaboration between the IAM community and STAT and behavioral studies, which may prove beneficial in understanding which technology should be prioritized for development and how much and where this should happen. When we look at policy mixes and innovation, research and learning are key features of IAMs, and many IAMs feature by now endogenous learning, either in some technologies or more generalized. However, learning usually happens under the assumption of perfect information and foresight. This moderates the support for specific technologies depending on the strength of climate target and future availability of clean technologies. And here, this brings on two further critiques to IAMs. First, the first one relates to the fact that the technological innovation process should be seen in the broader socio-political context and not limited to the technology availability. And the second one is that future technology landscape suggested by IAMs is many times based on immature technologies deployed at large scale, and the most prominent example here being BECCS. Although IAMs are addressing these issues by scenario analysis, reflecting ranges of possibilities rather than fixed solutions, much more research needs to go into understanding what helps the scale up of new technologies, or what is the role of the larger public and the public acceptability or the public funding going into it. And finally, political processes. So the critiques relate to no policy feedback mechanism included in IAMs, or favoring mitigation for long-term objectives versus immediate action, or ignoring other societal goals. But whilst in the last one, there has been quite a lot of progress in the IAM research. More is needed to understand how to model better these political processes. And finally, but not last, is related to the use and interpretation of model results. And as we have seen up to now, IAMs are complex and large models, which creates difficulties with transparency and explicit documentation of modeler choices. And although there has been a great activity and discussion in the community of how to increase transparency, fully documenting all modeler choices for a given modeling exercise is likely to remain a challenge in the future. In order to be salient, the model needs to speak to the policy agenda or be policy relevant. However, this sometimes can undermine scientific credibility and impartiality of analysis. For example, if modeling decisions are made for non-scientific reasons in order to appeal to policy audiences. And further, if you think of these policy audiences, they can also, a further concern raised by the scientific community is that these policy audiences can also influence the possibility space mapped by the IAMs, which leads to IAM analysis evidencing particular pathways while others remain unmapped. To counterbalance this resulting power bias of scenarios, more engagement with other voices and perspective is needed to make it more relevant and also improving the legitimacy of the analysis. Recent focus on technologies and costs recently the traditional focus on IAM analysis on costs and technologies has been shifting towards wider impacts on the society, including distributional effects. In this sense, we note that IAMs may not be the generators of narratives, but they do amplify them. Finally, model how to interpret and communicate model results to the wider audiences is an ongoing discussion, which we think that combines two slightly different issues. One is a clear and consistent communication on model limits. So what that means on the side of IAMs, an explicit recognition of what a specific model can say about a particular topic, that would clarification on that would help. And then the second one, maybe more effort in explaining model and interpretation of the results in the real world would be useful. So for example, including an interpretation phase as a discrete phase of work when the analysis is communicated, as is done in other fields, actually. And now to conclude, to summarize this, integrated assessment models have played and are playing a central role for academic and policy-focused assessment of climate change and mitigation. And in spite of their shortcomings, some of which we have identified in our review, there are few alternatives which can provide what IAMs provide: an internally consistent virtual laboratories of the complex interacting social, economic, and technical and physical systems. Our review identifies 6 areas of critiques and also critical items for future IAM development and use. And we highlighted that whilst IAMs can pursue several avenues for further development, it is critical. The engagement and interaction with other modeling community is critical for further development. And I will leave you there, so we have enough time for discussion as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Isabella. Great. Thanks a lot for a very comprehensive overview of a wide range of topics, and also thanks for keeping it perfectly in time, actually. Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. And we have already 9 questions, so a lot of interest and questions on these topics. Now, as I said, we have 6 panelists here also who have contributed to this work and who are all experts on these topics and are happy to answer these topics. So let's maybe go in the order of the topics. There is also the possibility to comment if you like some of them, you can like. Let's start maybe with the comment by Andrew McConnell that Panagiotis, you could maybe answer on the role of finance and capital markets, and especially the role of money creation. Panagiotis, if you're there.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Johannes, and also thanks for the question. Yeah, I think it's what you mentioned is actually correct. I mean, the conventional type of IAMs actually assume that investment is actually restricted by the household saving, and this is actually the main assumption behind the CEST models. And now, the very last years, it is agreed that we constantly improve the financial representation in the model. So actually introducing some financial agents that can actually, as you correctly said, they can create some money like a bank, and then the different agents can borrow from them. But what is actually is also required is not assuming that all this will come for free, for instance, because money cannot be oversupplied, for instance, but we also include the feedbacks to the entire economy in the sense that we model this towards the most how to say, pragmatic way in order to reflect also the real market reaching.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I agree. Thanks. Okay, let's move on the question. Thanks, Panayotis. There's a question by Joel Moorland. Roberta, you said you might be responding to that regarding to the interpretation of likelihood of targets of scenarios. Roberto Schäfer, if you can hear me.
Thank you. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, in fact, I think it's a very good question, but this question belongs more to climate models than exactly to IAMs, because normally, let's say IAMs rely heavily on climate models. In that case, the uncertainty associated with 1.5 degree scenarios or 2 degree scenarios will lead to, let's say, a kind of carbon budget. And this carbon budget normally, or the remaining carbon budget, is used as a constraint in the IAMs. So that's why, let's say, in that case, normally we assume a kind of a deterministic approach. Let's say based on a specific carbon budget that comes out of a climate model, that then we run this as a constraint in our IAM. But for sure, this is a problem because climate models, they are not deterministic. So you have uncertainties associated with the different temperature outcomes. And that's why sometimes really confusing to have, let's say, similar carbon budgets associated with different temperature outcomes, simply because we're talking about different, let's say, probabilistic assumptions here. So this is something that we have to improve our language in order to be able to better, let's say what we're talking about. And that's why over time, we're trying to avoid now to associate a specific IAM with a specific temperature, but try to associate more with a specific remaining carbon budget, simply because if in the future, let's say you have new climate models that associate different climate budget with different temperatures, then our results will not be based on the temperature, but on the carbon budget. That's why more and more, let's say, we're focused the report on carbon budgets and say, as of today, this carbon budget is equivalent to this kind of temperature outcome. But later on, eventually, with more learning in the climate, let's say, community, we can say that carbon budget now is associated with a different temperature. Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. That's an important move to carbon budgets in that. Oriane, I think you offered to answer the next question by Kelsey Perlman on complexity versus accuracy of models.
Yes, exactly. So the statement that was made was that complexity potentially makes the models lose accuracy, and I think what was meant is that you really have to carefully think about what complexity you want to take into account and what complexity you don't want to take into account within the context of the broad scope of the models. And so not necessarily does complexity add to the models. And so that's just a very careful consideration that you have to make. So, for example, if you think about different types of consumers, you might want to add complexity if you want, to understand their different preferences and attitudes or something. But how much does that mean if you're looking into projections up to 2100? So those kind of details might become very uncertain, actually make the model less transparent. But the example mentioned here about biodiversity loss, which is also very complex, might actually have more generalizable, might be based on more generalizable relations that do keep their meaning over time. So it depends on the topic, but the statement was more to be very careful in not just adding more details, because in some cases they won't lead to additional information.
Thanks, Ariane. Then we have another question on the more technology side, which is by Jim Ski on whether learning is global or there are spillover effects also across regions. I think Roberto, you just, are you typing there?
Yeah, I can answer live. Thank you, Jim, for the question. In fact, let's say most technologies or learnings are represented at the global level because most technologies are global, like electric vehicles, batteries, etc., etc. But depending upon which IAM you're talking about, you can be more specific and go deep into a specific region where that particular technology can behave slightly different. So I would answer, it's global, but you can do some more specific treatment in specific regions for specific technology when it's very local. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Yes, one question by Robbie Morrison, I don't know who would answer, is on open, let's say open source, open data, open licensing. Yeah, anyone has any comment on this important issue in software development maybe, but also to IAMs?
Yes, I could start, and Will, then you can complement me. So I suppose some of the integrated assessment models are going open source and putting everything online from data to methods. Everything is fully visible. Something we have noted in our review is that it's many times is not that easy to understand all the assumptions, even with the fully open data. You need to be trained to understand, so it's not necessarily increasing transparency by just putting them in the public domain. However, what we note is that going open source is helpful because the pool of users is increasing, so then the scrutiny coming from the inside, it's really positive and will help with the transparency of the models.
Yes, it's also mentioned in the article actually. Okay, thanks. Another question by Jim Ski on co-benefits. Yeah, I mean, are the co-benefits explicitly taken into account also in terms of costs? It's a challenge, of course. I don't know if anyone has a particular comment on that.
If I can comment on that, Johannes. Thanks again, Jim. The answer, let's say, the short answer is no. Let's say normally, let's say we focus on climate, let's say, outcomes, and we see co-benefits as co-benefits. So we say, okay, our results somehow are conservative because we are not factoring in the co-benefits associated with doing that. But more and more IAMs are beginning to incorporate other dimensions as well. So more and more, we're trying to incorporate the different SDGs into the equation. So now we have IAMs that also look into the co-benefits of air pollution, of biodiversity, etc., etc. So if in the beginning this was not an issue, now more and more we're beginning to try to incorporate the benefits of the co-benefits in the IAM. So this is, I think, is a frontier of the knowledge, and we are moving in that direction to better represent other dimensions besides climate mitigation only.
Thanks, Roberto. An important point. It's for sure. Another topic, let's take them together, two questions, is on uncertainty. That, yeah, uncertainty was not mentioned as a main challenge. Questions by Tim Brennan and Evangelos Panos. How can, let's say, the IAM community, what could we do to improve the frameworks to represent uncertainty? I mean, there are many sources of uncertainty, as we know. Yeah, I mean, the question, is that a challenge, or how can, let's say, the consideration of uncertainty be improved? If someone has a particular opinion or comment to that, useful.
If I can, again, let's say, comment very briefly here. There is, let's say, a computational limit on doing that. Some IAMs are beginning to consider the possibility of running, let's say, IAM stochastically. But in order to be able to do that, you need to move to supercomputers. So this is something that's being discussed these days, whether or not to run several deterministic scenarios or to go to a probabilistic approach, but then computational power is a limitation because as of today, IAMs are sufficiently, let's say, sophisticated to have runs that can take 20 hours, 30 hours, 40 hours for a single deterministic run. So that's why I think it's more a computational limitation than really a weakness associated with the tool. Thank you.
Can I also chip in, please, Johannes, just to complement what Roberto has been saying? So a kind of a different approach, which is taken in some modeling communities, for example, TIAM UCL, the one I'm more aware of, is to opening the model assumptions to scrutiny to a wider audience through workshops, looking into different aspects of the models and discussing actually with different audiences issues of data quality or issues with how we do the modeling of certain technologies. So I think that increasingly should become a way of opening the models to scrutiny when you actually go forward and say, look, I'm not sure about this. We are making these assumptions, but we are inviting other communities to chip in and advise, is it our view correct, or should we improve it? How can we improve it? There are loads of experimental studies out there which would have data which may be fit for some of the models. So I think collaboration with others will also help this aspect of tackling uncertainty.
Yes, thanks. Another comment, a bit related in my opinion, is on the temporal dimension. So there's one question on the infinite horizon. I mean, do you consider like the long term, really? I mean, infinite horizon in some economic models, they are based on infinite horizons. How is it considered in dynamic IAMs? Another question, yeah, also about intergenerational equity discounting. How is that considered by IAMs? And the related question is, do IAMs represent heterogeneous interest rates for different countries or individuals? And I think, Julia, at least on the last point you wanted to comment, maybe also on the former points.
Yeah, thanks, Johannes. So yeah, maybe on the last part, on the last point, yeah, I think it's a key question, and I guess right now most IAMs works with limited heterogeneity related to interest rates, whether it be for regions or technologies and so on. And it's actually a key question because it has implication on, for instance, on the cost of technologies. If you take like the same interest rate for let's say solar and conventional technology, you will to some extent underestimate let's say the risk, for instance, linked to new technology. And it's the same for the country. It's kind of important to integrate to modulate the interest rate in relation to the specific country risk, for instance, that actually exists in real life. So I think it's an area of improvement for IAMs, and I think so there are some ongoing work on this aspect, and it's actually completely feasible to model heterogeneity of interest rates in IAM. So I would say it's feasible technically, but work should be done. More work should be done to actually test heterogeneity on these parameters and the implication for mitigation pathways and technology deployments across the regions.
Yeah. Yes, thanks. Okay, next question is by Felix Schaumann. Yeah, I think Will, you offered to answer it on structural model improvements.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point, and it's something that the paper addresses. You know, the question being, you know, in responding to criticism, should we do more modeling, or should we think better about how to understand the modeling that we're doing and communicate that? I think the answer from the paper is a mixture of the two, but you know, there are certainly critiques about how modelers think about interpreting and communicating their, their results, and those are talked about in the paper. And yes, indeed. So we recommend thinking more about the interpretation phase, thinking more about what the models can say and what they can't say, given what what knowledge has gone into them. And so yes, I think our response to the criticisms is that modelers should be thinking about both, about improving the models themselves, but also thinking about how can we better interpret, communicate, understand, and explain what the models can and can't do, and be clearer about the limitations of the modeling analysis.
Thanks, yes. Another point, maybe a bit in the same direction, is again by Joel Morland on IAMs often have long smooth curves but fail to model physical, like climate tipping points, for instance. And there's another question related to that, that impacts on climate from climate change are not considered, especially also impacts on economic growth. Is that something also, or what could IAMs do to take into account these climate feedbacks? Or should they in anyhow? I mean, maybe a general question if someone has a comment.
If I can comment very briefly on that, this is also another frontier in IAMs. And it's a very good criticism, which as of today, IAMs do not incorporate the vulnerability of climate change. So you have, let's say, a kind of static IAM running the same way in a 1.5 degree kind of scenario, or in a 2 degree, or in a 4, or in a 5 degree scenario. So this is something that the community is very much aware these days, and now we're beginning to see the first efforts to try to look into what's the temperature pathway we're talking about, and try to go back to the IAM to better represent the impact of that on agriculture, on hydroelectricity, etc., so that we have, let's say, the technology represented in such a way that's compatible with the climate stress that particular technology will be subject to. So this is also something progress is being made on that today, but let's say as of today is not really a reality yet. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. That's sort of time what impacts, and that's one way to improve them. Another question by Jane Leggett of different limitations and different policy questions. Maybe that's something I think Roberto, you would be the best to answer.
I haven't seen the question itself. So if you can read that to me, it will be useful.
Yeah, how different, have you tried to assess the importance of different IAM limitations for specific kinds of policy questions? Or another way, specific types of climate policy questions, which IAMs would be the most, or characteristics are needed, and how, yeah. Is that important?
Let's say, somehow, let's say, the community is very much involved in different MIPS, let's say, model intercomparisons. And we try to do that exactly because some models better represent specific policies and other models better represent different policies. So one of the reasons why we have more and more being involved in MIPS, let's say, model intercomparison, is exactly to be able to have a range of results coming out of IAMs, exactly to avoid some bias specific to specific models, and by doing that, be more robust in the kind of answers IAMs can provide. So we're very much aware of that. And again, MIPS is one way to deal with that issue. Thank you.
Thanks. I think 2 more questions for now. I mean, one is about stock flow consistency by Jobst Heitzig regarding material sources. Is that an issue? Has it been considered? And also, again, the question of money, which we also discussed. But yeah, maybe regarding materials, or I know also, Isabela, you're an expert in this field for instance, also building infrastructure, etc. Is that important?
I suppose on the material side, yes, that is probably one of the critiques to IAM, that it's not that clear. The material flows through the system; they are partially disconnected For example, when you try to model things like circular economy solutions, it's harder to implement those kind of solutions in IAMs. I do not have on the top of my head how many of the IAMs actually tackle the material flow analysis beyond. So the energies flows, they are well quantified, and the money flows, materials and critical materials, for example, when it comes to solar PV or other very specific materials which are critical, have been coming in discussions, and there is where perhaps collaboration with other fields would be beneficial for IAM analysis to understand actually the knock-on on resource consumption from some of the pathways suggested by the models.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I have two other questions, which I think I can also combine. So a bit looking forward, one by John Model again, taken together. Do we have, let's say, do we under or overestimate the challenge ahead of us in some way? And a related question by Sara Giarola. Among the challenges discussed, which were could one prioritize in order to improve models, or which one should be the ones addressed first, if we have any? Of course, this is probably to some extent subjective, but yeah, if someone has made an opinion on that, I think, yeah.
You know what would have been useful to have now, kind of a open voting system where all the participants can actually vote. What do they think? Should the IAMs under or overestimate the challenges ahead of us? That is a really, really good question. And I suppose some of the discussion did come in with the consideration of climate change impacts on both the physical system and the economic system, which is not necessarily reflected right now in the decarbonization pathway. So probably if we include those, then well, I would say we are underestimating. Also, if we think of all the new infrastructure we need to put in for some of the large-scale CCS envisaged by some of the models, it's quite daunting, and those supply chains are not available yet, but they are not there. It's loads of to be doing. Many things which are assumed in place are not in place. So I think it's quite a the challenge ahead of us is really big, but yes, at least we can dig into potential pathways of which way could we go and understand consequences. Yeah, Roberto.
Yes.
Yeah, I fully agree with Isabella, but just to add one point here, given my current involvement in the IPCC and in one chapter, which is very much IAM focused, is a criticism that we receive a lot, and it's fair, is the issue of transparency. So let's say, besides the technical issues that Isabella very well have, let's say, discussed now, there are, let's say, critical issues in the IAMs itself, or technical issues, but then there is the issue that the community has to better deal with, which is the issue of transparency. Because some of the misunderstanding associated with the power of IAM is very much related to the difficulty so far to be more transparent on what IAM is, what are the assumptions we use in the IAM. So I think the community is trying to move in that direction to have IAMs that are really open source and database that are really open source, so that those data can be scrutinized and give more credibility to IAM. So I think this is, in the very short term, this is one of the most critical issues we have to deal with. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's an important point, and indeed, a lot of people are moving in this direction. I agree that, yeah, I mean, Isabella very nicely illustrates these different 6 areas. We didn't think of a Zoom voting. I'm sorry for that, to see which one could be a priority, but I think it is a good idea to maybe in next seminars or also stakeholder workshops to present these issues and to get an idea which should be the most important topics. Yeah, for improvement of IAM. So I think it's a good idea to now, based on these collected points, to also to prioritize the future developments. But as Roberto and others were saying, a lot of work is actually ongoing in many directions. I don't know if there's one last question on saying that IAMs are maybe not great at modeling second and third order effects, for instance, heat stress leading to reduced working hours. That is, yeah, just saying, I think also here it applies that there's ongoing works and several IAMs, including, for instance, impacts on labor productivity, on climate change, also on the supply side. So I think it's an ongoing debate. I don't know if someone else has a comment on that. But overall, yeah, I think we covered a lot of areas here. First of all, thank a lot Isabela for the great talk and all the panelists for answering very precisely. If someone wants to have a final word or open comment, go ahead. And otherwise, I think we're also almost out of time, but also perfectly, I think, in time to finish. Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. The paper is actually on the chat, so if you want to look at it, it's open access, so you can have a look. The video will be uploaded within the next 1 or 2 weeks on YouTube, on the CMCC channel. And yeah, I hope to see you at the next webinar or the next RFF-CMCC also Navigate webinar. And have a nice day. And thanks again for all the nice questions and great discussion. And a special thanks to Isabela for her presentation. And see you next time. Thanks a lot and have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.